Hello, Laura Trevelyan here again, and we are here to talk again about historical fiction. Now, last time I spoke to you, we talked about the ways in which historical fiction is abused by both writers and readers. And this week, we're going to talk about how you use historical fiction so that you are writing something that is useful and enjoyable for both readers and for yourself as a researcher to produce. Because there's nothing worse than putting all the effort that goes into creating a historical fiction, and they are a lot of work. The amount of research that has to go into them is part of what makes them so much more difficult to write, much more labor intensive than writing something that is involving a lot less research, something contemporary, a romance, a contemporary family saga. These sorts of things don't really require that kind of in-depth research. Even something like crime fiction, that once you understand the conventions of the genre and once you have that understanding of police procedures, legal procedures, that sort of thing, once you understand it, you don't need to research that again and again and again for every single novel that you produce. And so as a result, this kind of writing can be much, much faster. Of course, somebody's going to put up their hand and say, what about science fiction? What about world fantasy? They involve huge amounts of world building. But again, once you've built the world, those books can run very much faster because they're often written in a series. They often occur in the same world position. And so once you've done all that stuff at the front end or the back end of it, all that initial research and building, then the books themselves run quite a lot faster. Historical fiction is different because no matter how well you might know any particular part of history, there will always be something that you then have to stop and research. The biggest thing for historical fiction writers is falling down the rabbit hole of research. It's very, very tempting. It's something that, because historical fiction writers are interested in history, and they're interested in doing that research, they can fall down that rabbit hole very, very quickly. So it's a very particular genre. If you do not like doing research, then historical fiction is probably not for you, because you will fall into those traps and those shortcuts and those lazy things that we discussed in the last video when we talked about the abuses of historical fiction. What happens when you use a historical period but don't do your research on it, because that creates a whole raft of problems on its own. So why do we do historical fiction? Why write it if it's so incredibly difficult? Well, historical fiction can do things that straight historical research can't do. And this is something to remember, because straight historical fiction is, again, a narrative. People have a big misunderstanding on what history actually is. History is not just remembering names and dates and kings and this happened here and this happened there. If all I know is Richard III died at Boswell Field, is that understanding history? History is not just who, what, where. History, the actual study of history, is coming up with how and why. Why is one of the most important things. Now, you can just use straight history. However, finding out those whys is not something that is stable. Why changes. Why is not a single, once we find it out, we now know that definitively. This is a dynamic subject. You don't just pin it down, pin it to the wall and say, right, that's it, I'm done. Because of that, and because history does rely on documentation, and because there are large sections, especially the further back you go, of the population who are not served by that documentation, history is left with these gaps. We know about kings and queens, but what do we know as you get further and further down that social strata? People who leave less bits of paper behind. And people who leave less bits of paper behind are with us for a very long period. You go into the 1920s, the 1940s, you will find people who have not left bits of paper behind, or they've left marginal pieces of paper behind. And as a result, it's very, very difficult for pure historians to patch together a story of those people. We can get flashes of it, but it can be very difficult because historians are relying solely, and this is why it's a discipline, they rely solely on the evidence that is left behind, whether it is bits of paper or archaeological evidence or oral history, but we are reliant on that as historians. Now, the writer of historical fiction is not so tied to the evidence. And as a result, stories that have been buried, histories that have been buried, generally of marginalised communities, be that ethnic, religious, class-based, gender-based, sexual orientation, all of these groups that may not fit within that vast dominant narrative that has left large amounts of documentary evidence behind are not served. This is where the historical fiction writer can come in. Because they're not bound to that documentary evidence, they can take what does remain and they can embroider and elaborate over it. Now, this is very, very delicate work because one does not wish to embroider over what exists to such an extent that you create a new pattern, a totally new pattern, but one does need to reinforce those bare patches so that the story is cohesive. So it's quite a balancing act. And because you are trying to balance these things against each other, you have competing needs. You have the needs of history and the needs of narrative. And because your primary focus, your genre of writing is narrative, those narrative needs are going to be a little above. However, this does not mean that what you then do is to just, oh, I don't know this, I will make it up. You have to extrapolate. You have to find what is the nearest thing that we have evidence-wise that I can use in this place to help bridge this gap. So it is very useful for that. So being able to find those hidden voices is very useful for that. It's also useful for being able to set a mirror up to our world. History is not setting a mirror up to the past because, as I said, there is no definitive past that we can reflect back. A great many people would wish this were the case. A great many people who claim to like history, do have a desire to be able to recreate it in all its glory. However, it's not possible. It is always going to be a distorted reflection. However, what we can do is use events from the past to talk about now, just as Arthur Miller did in The Crucible, talking about the witch hunts, the Salem witch hunts, and discussing that in relation to McCarthyism. So we're able to say something about the world that we live in today, and do it in a way that is less direct, it's less confronting to a reader. So sometimes you can talk about things that are controversial, things that may cause a great deal of offence, talk about how we do things now by making people look at, oh, that's wrong. And if that was wrong then that's still wrong now. Of course, doing these things means to step outside the box of pure realism and step into a new paradigm, which is metafiction, or as Linda Hutchins calls it, histographic metafiction, where you as a writer are consciously making the reader consciously aware that what they are reading is narrative. Kate Grenville does this in Joan Makes History, where because of the choppy nature of the narrative and all the Joans throughout Australian history, throughout the first 100 years or so from 1788 to Federation, throughout that period of white Australian history, we are aware that we are reading a constructed narrative, but we are reading a constructed narrative of a forgotten voice, the women who made history in Australia. So she's holding it up and saying, here are forgotten people. Here are people who also made history, who are not the men in the uniforms or the men in the explorers' outfits or the men doing this, the men in the mines. These are the women who are there at their side. And so be able to talk about that. It's also a way of creating identity. So, and talking about identity. And in this way, I'm thinking of a writer like Patrick White and his great novel of the Australian expanse, the interior, Voss. And he's talking about us now. He's talking about his contemporary audience. He's talking about Australia and the fact that we don't look inward, that we're a country looking outward to the sea, to places beyond the sea, and yet inside is where the mystery is. That we will never understand ourselves, we will never be ourselves until we come to terms with this continent. So there are many, many uses for historical fiction. This is not the totality of it, but in short, we are looking to raise voices that are not heard in dominant histories. We are looking to talk about contemporary themes, and we're looking to talk about contemporary identity. So these are some of the uses of historical fiction. Now, next time I see you, I will be back and doing some more research. I'll be taking you again into some research, and I'm looking forward to that. We will also be starting to have a look at Australian writers and their impact on things. So look out for that. And I look forward to seeing you again.